Right, so 2 years on from October 7th, as we now are, and Israel's genocide of Gaza has ended up gutting its own economy. And the wreckage of that is everywhere. A steel company in Ashdod has just gone bankrupt as Turkey finally cut trade over the genocide. The entire Port of Eilat is in the same boat. Growth has stalled at 0.9%. Defence costs have doubled, and tens of thousands of Israeli businesses have shut up shop. For decades, ratings agencies called the economy resilient, immune to politics, a start-up nation that could bomb with one hand and bank with the other. Well, that illusion's gone, hasn't it? The genocide that has starved Gaza is now starving Israel of markets, credit, and confidence. The numbers say what the spokesman won't. The price of impunity, no matter how many Western states, leaders, and other international bodies try to shield them, is still very much being paid at home. Oh dear, how sad. Never mind. Right, so Israel's economy fracturing yet further. The reliance on international trade exposed yet again as a fundamental underlying weakness of the state that no amount of political and diplomatic cover can hide. Because the numbers people, the bankers, they only care about one thing, and Israel's supposedly divine right to exist and do whatever the hell it likes isn't it. So let's start with the news of this latest company going bust then, shall we? A mid-sized steel company in Ashdod has gone bust. Not a speculative start-up or even a poorly run firm. It was a functioning manufacturer that relied on regional trade. And then that trade was deliberately cut. Turkey imposed a ban on exports and imports with Israel after the devastation in Gaza reached a scale that Ankara apparently could no longer ignore. Within months, the Shul company collapsed. Its petition to the Israeli courts listed debts of roughly 105 million shekels, about 32 million US dollars. Its turnover had fallen from about 200 million shekels in 2022 to roughly 35 million 2 years later. 70% of its income had come from Turkey alone before the genocide on Gaza. Consequences for Israel. They seem so rare, they always turn out to be newsworthy, don't they? There was no mystery in the cause here, though. The company said openly that it could not survive Turkey's embargo, imposed in protest at Israel's genocide. And the significance of this is structural. The belief that Israel's economy was insulated from the politics of occupation basically ended that day. For years, officials and analysts insisted that the self-styled startup nation could fight indefinitely without consequence, that high technology, US aid, and Western trade ties would always absorb any political blow. And that myth is now cracked. The Gaza bankruptcy wasn't the beginning of Israel's economic implosion at all, just the latest proof of it. The rot to its economy set in long ago when the war turned from invasion to occupation and the bills started coming due. Every month since October 2023, and frankly there were issues before that too, has tightened the squeeze. Collapsing trade, falling growth, mounting debt, and an economy increasingly at war with itself. So the Ashdod case didn't trigger the crisis, it just exposed how deep it is running now. Turkey's trade embargo came into force in May of last year. The Bank of Israel's subsequent assessment estimated about $1 billion in losses from that ban alone, again reinforcing how reliant Israel's economy is on foreign trade and economic ties. One company's insolvency sits inside that figure. The point is not the amount, although it's certainly not an insignificant amount, we're talking millions here, but it is the direction. Accountability, even partial and self-interested, has entered the economy. The war's cost is now counted in balance sheets, not just in lives. The same pattern surfaced at the Red Sea. The Port of Eilat, Israel's only outlet to the Indian Ocean, declared bankruptcy after commercial activity collapsed by roughly 85%. Houthi forces in Yemen targeted Red Sea shipping as retaliation for Israel's assault on Gaza, as we all should know well by now, especially regular viewers of this channel. And the carriers, of course, rerouted to avoid the risk, and cargo volumes evaporated as a result of that. So by the middle of last year, the port company themselves admitted insolvency. So these are not isolated disruptions, they're linked outcomes of the same policy choice. A government that treats war as sustainable, encountering an external world that doesn't agree with it. What both of these bankruptcies expose, though, is the fragility behind Israel's reputation for self-reliance. It really is anything but. The economy is heavily import-dependent and regionally entangled with neighbouring nations. When neighbours close their ports or when ships refuse to sail, the domestic machine stalls. Sovereignty, coming back to that increasingly common theme in my content of late, it just seems to keep cropping up, really, as a point, in this sense has limits. The state can occupy land and it can devastate others with warfare, but it can't compel people to trade with them. It's why BDS works at the end of the day, isn't it? The data shows how deep that exposure runs to. Israel imported about 1.95 billion US dollars worth of iron and steel and 1.97 billion in articles of iron or steel in 2024. Index Mundi's production series places domestic raw steel output in Israel below 500,000 tonnes, which is negligible by global industrial standards. The stainless steel market that they have, which is valued at roughly 1.05 billion US dollars in 2024, still relies largely on foreign input. These are material concerns. They're the backbone of construction and manufacturing. You cut them and the system is anything but self-sustainable. And that vulnerability exists across other sectors in Israel too, not just the example given for steel here. Total imports at 91.87 billion US dollars in 2024 to Israel, and a trade deficit of 31.6 billion. GDP growth slowed to 0.9%. Defence spending doubled from 4.2% of GDP in 2022 to about 8% in 2024. Each figure is factual. It's hard numbers in a spreadsheet, each pointing the same way. Israel is spending more on war and earning less from trade. The burden has shifted from external to internal. What once looked like control now looks like complete dependency, and that's an increasingly growing weakness. So when the Gaza company went under, it revealed that dependency in miniature. A firm integrated into a neighbour supply chain couldn't survive a split with that neighbour. The old model, dominance abroad, security at home, depends on a constant inflow of regional labour, materials, and legitimacy. But when the legitimacy fractures, even a well-connected state begins to look increasingly more vulnerable, and so it is proving to be the case. By the middle of last year, about 46,000 Israeli businesses had already closed as a result of the genocide. Some closures were temporary, many were not. Tourism had collapsed, consumer spending had contracted. The combination of mobilization of working people being drafted and inflation and falling confidence produced the first broad stagnation since the pandemic. S&P's reaffirmation of Israel's credit rating came with a negative outlook and a warning about security risk. The OECD's 2025 outlook described high defence costs and slowing investment. None of these institutions are political opponents of Israel. They're simply number crunchers when we boil it all down. Their data confirms what domestic rhetoric still denies, though, that the war's economic price is a very real one. Therefore, Israel can choose repression, but it cannot choose immunity from it. Their choice comes at a national cost. Every strike on Gaza now carries a financial echo. Each month of siege is another notch of deficit or lost capital. The line between moral and economic isolation is closing in, and although you can argue other states like the US might prop them up financially, again it comes at cost. Turkey's role illustrates both the potential and the limits of regional pressure. Ankara can cut trade in metals and cement and other materials tied to construction. It didn't halt energy transit, though. Crude oil shipments from the port of Ceyhan to Israel have continued regardless. Roughly 40% of Israel's crude supply arrives through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline from Azerbaijan. At 1.27 US dollars per barrel in transit fees, Turkey has no incentive to shut that flow off. So their morality via their embargo only goes so far. Erdogan is very much two-faced, and that's the point I've said in other videos as well. The government publicly denied that oil still moved to Israel, calling such claims unfounded. Yet UN trade data compiled by Turkish Minute showed Turkey remained Israel's fifth largest exporter throughout last year, with nearly 2.9 billion US dollars in recorded trade. The numbers contradict that rhetoric, but the embargo's partial enforcement, as it functionally is, as it really is, still had effect. It closed a channel that mattered enough to bankrupt a company still. So there were still consequences here. Ankara's double posture, though, exposes the reality of selective accountability. States act where the cost suits them. Turkey punished Israel in sectors that delivered domestic political gain and international approval whilst protecting its energy interests. Israel still paid a price. They could be paying a bigger and more meaningful one, though. So the myth of total insulation died even under a half-enforced embargo, though. The failure of the Ashdod plant is proof that partial measures, as much as we can criticise them, still do bite. The internal side of the equation shows the same erosion. Mobilisation for war removes tens of thousands of people from civilian work. Therefore, agriculture and construction and technology sectors lost staff. Foreign labour contracted as insecurity rose. Supply lines tightened. The gap was filled not by efficiency but by deficit spending. Military expenditure rising from 4 to 8% of GDP within 2 years created a structural shift. That shift competes with social budgets and forces higher borrowing. With growth below 1%, the cost of capital rises, debt service climbs, inflation cuts wages. We experience rather the same thing here in the UK, don't we? But our media Still try to convince us that growth figures of 0.5%, for example, are wonderful. Clearly not. But back to the point at hand with Israel anyway. A country cannot indefinitely fund occupation abroad and consumption at home when both depend on imported capital and materials. What is now visible is not collapse but repricing. The market adjusting to risk created by political arrogance. The rating outlooks, the bankruptcies, the deficit numbers, the insurance premiums for Red Sea routes, they are all instruments of the same correction. The world's beginning to charge Israel the interest it's managed to avoid for decades. The line of accountability, perhaps it's not an obvious one here, but it does nevertheless add up when you think about it. No formal sanctions regime exists here. Yet Israel firms are losing access to partners, their investors are adjusting to exposure, and logistical costs have just gone up and up and up. Markets are not moral actors at all, they're anything but. But as a rule, they react to instability. And when instability is tied to a state's own aggression, its financial discipline starts to resemble justice anyway. S&P and Moody's adjustments are technical events, but their effect is political. They make continued war more expensive. Insurance underwriters now price shipments to Israeli ports higher because of Red Sea risk. Not that they choose to go through it as a rule anyway, but it's a heck of a longer distance to go around Africa. Pensions funds face public campaigns against holding Israeli bonds. Universities and charities and consumers are shifting procurement, especially as more people rally against them and demand change from them. These changes are incremental, but they all add up at the end of the day too. The cost of impunity is entering ordinary accounting now more and more. And the same logic applies domestically too. The Port of Eilat is no longer a functioning trade gateway at all. It's gone bust. The start-up nation narrative that once insulated the government from criticism now rings rather hollow. Startups depend on foreign capital and open markets, yet both are sensitive to perception. Investors read the same news as everyone else does, don't they? A government that faces genocide allegations at the ICJ cannot also sell itself as a safe innovation hub without paying some sort of penalty. And that discount is now visible in capital flight and postponed projects and a flattening growth curve. And what is especially notable here is that history teaches us that an economic reckoning often precedes political change. The numbers strip away rhetoric. They show that sovereignty maintained through coercion creates dependence elsewhere, on loans and on imported labour and on external tolerance. Israel's power abroad is being met by counterpower in the language it cannot ignore. Price. The state still has buffers, of course, though. The US aid continues, it may even increase. Western banks maintain lines of credit, some regional partners stay quiet. None of this alters the trajectory, though. Every layer of support now carries increasing reputational cost for those who provide it. Governments that shield Israel diplomatically are underwriting an economy whose fundamentals are weakening under their own eyes and whose own citizens resent paying for that. That's the beginning of isolation. It moves not through boycotts necessarily in and of themselves, but also through risk assessments and budget reviews and electability as well. At street level, the effect is visible. Shops closed, construction slowed, agricultural exports stuck at ports that no longer receive reliable shipping, inflation and taxation eroding disposable income. Citizens feel the pressure, but they're all told it's the price of security. Well, more and more are choosing to leave Israel, presumably to go back where they are really from, a lot of them, to get away from it all. It is in fact the price of impunity, a debt incurred by state choices. The government could of course change course. It's chosen not to and is doubling down on it, all tied of course when you pull all of these strands together to keeping Benjamin Netanyahu in power. The repetition of resilience in official language is itself a tell. Resilience is what governments say when they are absorbing damage. The data contradicts the sloganeering, though. Growth below 1% is not resilience. Doubling defence spending is not stability. A bankrupt port and a bankrupt steel firm are not anomalies. They're part of a trend. They're warnings written into the accounts. And this was not an oversight, it was policy. Ankara chose to act. The Houthis chose to target shipping. Credit agencies chose to recalculate. Each made a sovereign decision in response to Israel's own. Israel's learned that sovereignty, therefore, cuts both ways, even if their own is considered deified as far as they're concerned. Power projected outward invites resistance inwards. The economic price is only now beginning to show, perhaps, but it is showing, and it's showing Israel they aren't special when the accounts are made to balance. Of course, one destination for Israelis choosing to get away from Israel has been Cyprus, just off the coast, very appealing. Concern has been growing there that Israel is buying too much land and property there, in fact. Some concern that Israel is attempting Operation Promised Land 2.0 there after Palestine. What a preposterous idea, many said. Then an Israeli gets sent down for 5 years on 40 charges of apparent land theft. Not so far-fetched anymore then, perhaps? Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.